In today's episode of the Leadership Zone, I'm talking about my conversation with Sara and the types of things it brought up, from how our workplace is designed to who it's designed to support, to ideas of success, to ways of supporting each other, to ways of supporting ourselves. So Sara brought up so much for me in that conversation and had me thinking about how the workplace is inherently designed for some, and the sum isn't most. And that when we aren't considering what is motivating us, or what we define as success, or what voices in our heads are making decisions, it's very easy to get lost in the doing and to be distracted by high output and not necessarily the quality or the wisdom or the diversity that each one of us brings into the workplace. And I think that we, in workplaces, and when we're thinking about leadership and we're thinking about performance and sustainability, it's really important that we are thinking about the ways we work and what we deem as the norm, and whether that norm actually supports ourselves or others to thrive. And a lot of the time, I see this going missing in organizations where there's a lot of fear, insecurity, anxiety. And it's not because of the fear, insecurity, and anxiety. It's because people continue to be motivated and engage with fear, anxiety. And they just keep going, that hamster wheel. And when we're doing that, when we keep going in that way, we miss the opportunity to work smarter, not harder. But we also miss the opportunity to notice how needs shift and change. Yes, over time and with age, but also based on life experiences, changes in one's own feelings, emotions, abilities, preferences, capabilities, responsibilities. I also was thinking about when I talked to Sara, and obviously Sara specialises in working with women, and there's lots of really good reasons for that. And it got me thinking about how often, and Dr. Jessica Taylor talks about this, what about-isms. It's when we talk about a particular topic and somebody says, but what about, and talks about a completely different remit because they don't feel that it's relevant to them. And so this often happens when I talk about any particular identity. So women is a prime example. And I'm sharing this with you because as leaders, you may be the one doing the what about me, but you also may be somebody in a room who doesn't know what to do with it when people you're working with are doing that. So for instance, if I am talking about land and somebody says, but what about the sea? And the remit of the conversation is about the land, that is not a good faith question in that moment, unless it's been agreed that it is. That is we need to decide whether that's a discussion to be had elsewhere. But that happens with identity groups all the time. If we're talking about women, people say, what about men? If we're talking about straight people, people say, what about queer people? If we're talking about race, people say, what about me? If we're talking about religion, they say, what about my religion? There's this constant what about me stuff. And the reason that I think that's important to consider is two. One is it's a way to distract from the topic that's being discussed. So if we're talking about women, it's really important that we think about why we're talking about women and that we contribute to that conversation. That doesn't mean that in that conversation we won't also consider non-binary people, men, and people outside of that identity group. But it means that our first port of call in this conversation is looking at those needs and those people. And also the other element that can be a challenge is the intersectional identity. When people are saying, what about me? We start talking about the identity of people rather than the needs of people. Because if we're talking about women and their need for the workplace to be more flexible and appropriate, that's going to benefit everybody. Because if we use that principle for women, we're going to see how that principle is also applicable for with other identities. And as leaders, it's really important to know the difference and to be able to manage the nuance of expanding a conversation because it's appropriate and hijacking conversation to decenter the topic or to recenter a certain topic that may not be chosen. And this is really hard to do because sometimes we don't know if it's a decentering or a distraction, and sometimes we don't know if actually it's a reasonable consideration. But equally, if we like the person or we think they're decent, we may want to help them feel included, even though they have opted into a conversation and are deciding to recenter a different topic. What about me? What about this? So I think it's really important if we're having very specific topics, like I'm going to use women because I teach women in leadership. I facilitate groups around gender equality in the workplace and loads of other groups around equality, like race groups around equality, groups related to LGBTQ plus needs around equality, groups related to disabilities around equality. And one of the things that happens in these groups is that at times people desire for that topic to take into account their considerations, which is reasonable. But we have to decide whether it decenters the actual people we're speaking about or whether it serves the community further. And there are nuances to that when I'm facilitating those conversations. And it's important for you as leaders to think about that as well. Is the conversation you're having meeting the need of the group? Or is it being recentered as something else? What about me? When that might not be the optimal discussion right now. And that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. So often when I talk about, so I'm going to give you an example around women's needs. That's what I was doing a moment ago. When I'm talking about women's needs and we're facilitating some kind of group process, often people say, and what about? And they'll mention something usually to do with men or non-binary people. And that's often because we haven't positioned by addressing women's needs and have a direct impact on other groups. But we need to focus on this group because they're often overlooked in this discussion, for instance. But to focus on one group is not to exclude another. It's actually to say that this group is under-focused. And by putting attention onto this, if we can move the dial in this conversation, we can then allow that to also benefit the other groups, the other identities. But when someone says, what about, they are competing one group against another group. And I believe in true inclusion work, in true equality, we don't compete. We complement, we look for how difference of opinions, different experiences, different nuances can add value to our decision making, our insights, our understandings. But if somebody is bringing in a what about, and it's clear that this group is actually particularly serving a particular need, a particular unmet need for a very particular reason, then the question is this the right time for the what about? So that's the first question. It may not be. Is there a better time for the what about? Is this what about a reasonable consideration? So I'm going to give you an example from my own research. So in a PhD, you have to laser focus your topic, right? Because if you don't, you can't pass your Viva, you can't pass your PhD. The irony is you spend a lot of time learning to be an expert in the smallest pin of something. And when I say an expert, that doesn't mean you know everything. You just currently are meant to know the most up-to-date information on that very pinpointed piece of information. And then people will say to me, but why aren't you studying this? And I'm like, because if I study that, I broaden the scope and I'm less likely to get funded to achieve my PhD, to get my Viva. The same is true for things in organizations. Sometimes we have to be really specific about the thing we're going to impact so that we then can create ripple effects outwards. But if we aren't specific, what we're trying to impact may be changed. And so all inclusion has boundaries. When we're trying to do a piece of work in organizations, there need to be boundaries around the point of the work, the purpose, how we're going to do it, who should be involved in the conversation. That doesn't mean that we won't then later broaden the scope. But if you have a very broad scope, ironically, you actually end up not including a lot of people because you end up usually unconsciously repeating the pattern of dominant exclusion or power norms. So what's normally centered becomes centered again if you don't specifically focus on the area that you're trying to create more equality in or more inclusion in or more insight into. And so you need a very specific focus to create a change that's measurable. But that doesn't mean that that change won't broaden out further than that. But without that focus in the initial stages, you're not going to get somewhere with it. This contradiction that people struggle with, if inclusion has boundaries in organizations, and to create change, we have to look at some of the nuances that particular groups are experiencing, rework that so that there can be a wider change then. But if we start with the wider change, what often happens is that group's needs continue to be unmet because they don't hold the dominant power, or they're not accessing the kind of power structures that exist in the system in the first place, which is what you're trying to address and correct. And so it's just really important, if you're the what about person, to ask yourself, is that the piece of work the person was doing? Is that the purpose of the work? Or have I decided that's what they should be doing because that's the topic I'm interested in? And if it's the topic I'm interested in, I should probably be taking responsibility for leading on that in some way, or adding value to that, or facilitating that, rather than expecting that somebody else would reshift their focus that is probably well informed, hopefully well informed. And as leaders, it should be well informed. If we're not well informed, we need to look at how we're making decisions. A well-informed decision to my preference, that's domination. That's dominating somebody else's process rather than contributing or collaborating. If you believe that something is important, then it's really important for you to spark that and take responsibility for it. A lot of the time, what I find happens to any groups that are marginalised or experience marginalisation is that other groups say, yeah, but you haven't considered X, Y, and Z. That's not my job to consider those topics. That's not the focus I've chosen. I have the right to choose a focus. And in an organisation, usually the development or the areas of focus are based on an acknowledgement or a viewpoint that something isn't as equal or equitable as it needs to be in the organisation. And so it's not as simple as everybody decides what we focus on. Usually we look at what's least equitable at this point in time and then inform ourselves around that and then move from there. That doesn't mean that people won't come in and say, what about me? I feel like this topic's important. And there may be a point for them in the process, but also there may be a point that actually if that's the process they want, they may need to be part of creating that process rather than requiring a process that's well informed to move into it. And so, look, this came from talking to Sara Slattery around working with women. And the reason it does is I'm always thinking about inclusion from the lens of all people. And so I'm always thinking about what does that mean when I hear like, oh, we're speaking about this, what does that mean for other identities? And just because something is, and I talk about this always in the Women in Leadership program with UCD, just because something is more frequent in a particular identity group. So for instance, we would say there is a higher societal pressure on women to carry the responsibility of caring. Whatever the reason is, we know that it's there, it's been measured. By women and men, women hold it as well. It's not, and non-binary people, it's not that one particular gender holds it to another. Actually, we know that it's a shared expectation, often unconsciously. That doesn't mean to say that all women have that experience. And it also doesn't mean that no not men have that experience or no non-binary people have that experience. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that there's a higher frequency in this cohort of society. And sometimes what people hear is all or nothing. It's really important to know that a lot of the research statistics around different groups and different identities are saying that there's a higher frequency of a certain experience in this group. That doesn't mean other groups don't have it. It doesn't mean that everyone in this group has it. It's not a stereotype in the sense that all these people experience this. It is highest statistical occurrence of a behavior or an experience or a report of something in this cohort than in others. And it's really important that we think about that if we're going to engage in conversations where we focus on particular interventions and outcomes. We've got to say, why are we doing that? And it needs to be related to that kind of data. And some of the data is qualitative and some is quantitative and some is localized and some is more globalized and some is international and some is academic and some is industry. There's multiple places for data gathering. But just because something has a higher frequency statistically in a particular identity group isn't to say that all in that group experience that or are conscious of it or acknowledge it. And it's also not to say that others don't also experience that. It is simply to acknowledge the statistical difference in a particular cohort. And that is really powerful stuff that we need to think about more if we want to have conversations where we nuance differences without also either hijacking the nuances and pretending that it's not relevant or generalizing it and assuming that all people agree to this experience. There is no homogenous group in any identity group in society. Even if you share an identity with another group or with other people, doesn't mean you experience that identity the same way based on loads of different things: personality, character, other biases, culture, privilege, like other, look at the power wheel and the privilege wheel. But that's really important to keep in mind, because whenever I talk about one group, I always hear what about. But also when I'm thinking about one group, and this is probably an intersectional lens that's worth taking on board as leaders, it's worth thinking about how you can take that understanding. Okay, so the workplace, isn't designed for women. We know women are burning out at a higher rate. We know there are multiple reasons for that. And then to say, how could that knowledge be beneficial to women and also create a more inclusive, psychologically safe, high performing organizational culture here? How can my team benefit from me knowing this about women, even beyond women? Not ignoring, but including women and beyond. And I think the same goes for every group. We know that when you make improvements that facilitate disability access, that it benefits other people without those access needs. That actually it simplifies and improves inclusion of all, not just those intended. And that's true for every group I've ever worked with. When we become more inclusive, when we gather the art of being able to understand uniqueness and the nuances of how people are impacted by systems, when we understand that belonging is different for different people and for different reasons, and we understand and work with the ability to allow uniqueness to be there without people competing their uniquenesses, because that's a furthering of othering, which results in exclusion and rejection. If we can master that, if a master not as in a completed thing, but we can focus on developing that capacity to think about belonging and uniqueness and looking at the nuances of one identities group experience and thinking about how that nuance being supported could support wider identities and people's experiences, we're going to find that we use more intersectional lenses. We don't hijack conversations. We also don't ignore the other impacts. And one of the things I often say to people, because feminism at the moment and the patriarchy and how I hear men feel about some of these conversations, not because of the actual feminism and not necessarily because of equality, but because the way it's being discussed feels exclusionary. It really makes me think about how some of the biggest impacts that I've seen around these conversations, I'm going to use patriarchy as an example, is that the assumption is that patriarchy is being upheld and influenced and kind of done by men to women. And that's the issue. Patriarchy is a systemic practice of oppression that women, men, non-binary people engage with, often internalized because we're born into patriarchal societies. And yes, in that dynamic, people who are visibly male may receive more power and privilege. That is true in some ways, but they also pay a price. Now, the thing is, I'm not suggesting that that means, we shouldn't look at women's issues within the patriarchy or non-binary people's issues or trans people's issues within a patriarchal society. It's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is none of us exist within a system that we are not both impacted negatively to some degree, often trade some kind of positive impact. That doesn't mean I don't think it's an authentic impact, but there is some trading. We learn in oppressive systems how to gain power. So we are impacted negatively. Everybody has some level of oppression within an oppressive framework. We also usually find some way of trading for power. All of us do in some way. And then also the big thing that most people ignore is that we also uphold it, even those who feel most oppressed by it. And that is something that whenever I'm working with women around change or shift or changes in the workplaces, and men and non-binary people and trans people, is that the assumption is other people are maintaining the patriarchy or maintaining whatever the system of oppression is. And that's just not true in my experience. In my experience, we all have a role to play in how we're being oppressed, how we're oppressing, how we're trading and managing within the oppressive system. And it is far more complex than deciding that an identity group is doing it. And the research around women in workplaces is that women are not particularly oppressed by a gender. It's actually by the system. We all do it to women. And I think that's really important because that creates an accountability of we all exist within the system and we all have a role to play. But also we're all paying a price. And one of the biggest prices that I've seen men pay within the system is mental health, emotional well-being, relationships, a misunderstanding about how to engage with power effectively without dominating or being dominated, the ability to process their emotions. And there's loads of research behind this as well. So we need to think about how the system is harming all if we're going to talk about it. And we need to be careful about the divisive us and them. And this is coming from my idea about the gender kind of, if we're talking about women, What about non-binary people? What about men? What about trans people? The point is that by focusing on a nuance of something that is statistically higher in one group, you can help all groups. But if you create an us and them approach, an othering, you are facilitating further divide. That doesn't work long term. It isn't effective. It doesn't create shared change. It creates divisiveness. It creates competition. Those things do not help more effective, inclusive workplaces. And so you can focus on a nuance that one group experiences without rejecting a particular other group or a diminishing of another group. You can say, right now, this is our focus. And also, we hear that this is also important. Because in a lot of conversations, especially in workplaces, I'm going to just use gender again, and I'm using the binary men and women because that's where a lot of the research currently that I'm utilizing in my thinking is coming from. That's not suggesting, I don't believe it's a binary. I think it's much more diverse than that. But because the research is talking about those two things, that's kind of my best anchor for this moment, which is if we don't acknowledge how women's inequality in the workplace creates inequality for men, so for instance, or vice versa, if we don't acknowledge that if men are not being given the same responsibilities in the workplace for caring or the same leave, then it is going to disadvantage women because it means that women are less likely to be in the workplace as frequently as men are because there's an imbalance of how we are viewing care duties in our approach based on their gender. And that then creates more inequality in the workplace. So we can't talk about equality without considering the nuances. But we also have to make sure we don't hijack the purpose of the conversation and the unmet needs that we're initially addressing. I hope that is helpful. And I know that that goes way off from what Sarah and I was talking about, but it does expand on the nuances behind those conversations and some of the most common challenges that I see occur in the workplace for people. They don't know how to manage the what about me stuff. If you have any further questions, there's links below to get in contact. You can also pop to my website and see some of the online courses that are available or some of the services that I offer to organisations or coaching that I offer to leaders directly. Any questions, you can @ me at Sheila Walsh1 on any of the platforms or email me at info@sheilawalsh.com. There's also some freebies below that might be helpful to help you in your thinking and your development. Thank you very much for being with me.